The bridge gave way beneath the front wheels with a sound like a rifle shot, and Hester Shepherd felt the whole wagon lurch sideways into the roaring brown water of Willow Creek before she had time to do more than scream her brother's name. Peter Reed heard the crack from 50 yards off, where he had been kneeling at the near bank with his hat pushed back, studying the swollen creek and the rotted stringers of the old plank bridge the way. A man studies a rattlesnake he has already decided is too close. He had ridden out from the stage station that very morning meaning to close the crossing before anyone tried it, because the thaw had come hard and fast this year, and he had learned the hard way, only 11 months past, what a flooded Nebraska creek could do to a wagon and the souls riding in it. He did not think about that morning now. There was no time to think about anything except the woman going into the water. He was off his horse and running along the bank before the splintered planks had finished falling, his boots skidding in the mud, his eyes fixed not on the wagon, which was already lost, tipping and rolling with the current, but on the pale shape of a woman's arm breaking the surface 20 feet downstream. The team of horses screamed and thrashed in their traces, dragging the broken wagon bed like a raft of kindling. A boy's voice was shouting from the far bank, high and frightened, but Peter did not look at the boy either. He had one job in the space of the next 10 seconds, and he had already failed at that job once in his life. He was not going to fail at it twice. He went into the water at a dead run, feet leaving the bank entirely for a moment before the cold hit him like a fist to the chest, and he came up gasping and swimming hard across the current, angling downstream to meet the place he judged she would be carried rather than the place she had gone under. His father, a Missouri riverman before he had ever set foot on the plains, had taught him that much. Never chase the water, meet it. His hand closed on fabric, then on an arm, then on Hester Shepherd's shoulder, and he hauled her up against him with the current trying to tear them both toward a snag of driftwood that would have opened her skull if it caught her. She came up fighting coughing creek water, one fist catching him under the jaw before her eyes focused enough to understand he was not the flood trying to kill her. "Hold still," he said, or tried to say, the words half swallowed by water. "I have got you. Hold still and let me swim." "Danny," she gasped. "My brother, he was thrown clear. I saw him land on the bank. Tell me he is on the bank. He is shouting loud enough to wake the dead, which means he is breathing," Peter said, kicking hard for the near bank, the only bank that mattered now, dragging her weight against his own. "Kick if you can. Do not fight me." She stopped fighting him. That, more than anything, told him what kind of woman he had pulled out of Willow Creek. Not one who gave up, but one who understood in an instant when giving over control to another person was the only sensible thing left to do, and who did it without wasting breath on pride. They came out of the current together in the shallows below the bank, and Peter got his boots under him on the gravel and half carried, half walked her the last few yards onto the mud, where she folded down onto her knees, coughing, her sodden black hair coming loose from its pins, and streaming down over a face gone gray with cold and fear. The boy came scrambling down the bank a moment later, perhaps 15 years old, hatless, one sleeve torn, and threw himself down beside her, and she caught him against her before she had even gotten her breath back, checking him over with shaking hands the way Peter had seen mares check their foals, quick and thorough and entirely without sentiment until the checking was done, and only then did she let herself shake. "You are Peter Reed," she said, when she had enough air to say anything at all. Her voice carried the faint, unmistakable lilt of Ireland beneath the flat vowels of the plains, a voice that had learned English in 2 places. "The stage line scout. I am. You might have told the stage office that bridge was rotten before my father's wagon went over it. I did tell them. I told them a week ago, and I rode out this morning to put up a rope and a sign, because I did not trust anybody else to close it in time." He looked past her at the wreck of the wagon, caught now against a gravel bar downstream, one wheel still spinning slowly in the current, and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the creek water settle into his stomach. You are the Shepherd place up past the forks. I am Hester Shepherd, and this is my brother Danny, and that was every sack of seed corn we had for the spring planting, now halfway to the Platte. She pushed her wet hair back from her face with a hand that trembled, whether from cold or fury he could not yet tell, and looked at him with eyes the pale gray-green of creek ice. I am obliged to you for pulling me out of the water, Mr. Reed. I would be more obliged if the stage company had fixed that bridge before it took my seed corn, and very nearly took my life along with it. You are not wrong to be angry, Peter said, and meant it plainly enough that she blinked, some of the fire in her going still for a moment, as though she had expected him to argue and did not know what to do with a man who simply agreed. I am angry myself. Come on. Both of you are soaked through, and the wind is getting up. There is a fire and dry blankets a mile from here at the station, and I will send a man back for what we can salvage of your wagon once the water drops a little. He got them up onto his own horse, the boy first, then Hester behind him, and walked alongside, leading the animal by the bridle through the mud, because the horse could not carry the weight of 3 easily, and he was not about to leave either of them behind to catch a chill on the bank while he rode ahead for help. It was slow going. The whole prairie turned to black gumbo mud by the thaw, meltwater standing in every low place, the sky the flat pale blue of early April with high thin clouds moving fast from the west. Neither of them spoke much on that walk, Hester too cold and too shaken, Danny too embarrassed at having been thrown from the wagon like a sack of flour, but Peter watched her out of the corner of his eye the whole way, the way he watched everything, cataloging without quite deciding to. The set of her jaw even through the shivering, the way she kept one arm looped around her brother's waist the entire walk though the boy was nearly grown, the careful economy of her questions, asking only what mattered and nothing more. He thought, not for the first time in his life, but for the first time in a long while with any real interest, that here was a person worth paying attention to. He did not yet know that inside of 3 weeks he would refuse $200 in gold and greenbacks to hunt her down, and spend every cent he owned in the world trying to prove she had never done a single thing wrong. Willow Creek Station sat where the freight road crossed the creek on its way north toward the Black Hills, a low huddle of sod-roofed buildings and one real frame structure that served as the stage office, with a barn, a corral, and a scattering of homestead claims strung out along the bottomland for 5 or 6 miles in either direction. It was not a town, not yet, though the station master's wife liked to call it one, and it existed mostly because the Sydney-Deadwood Freight Road needed a place to change horses and mules on the long haul north to the gold camps, and because a handful of families, most of them come out from places that had used them poorly, had decided the creek bottom land was worth the gamble of a homestead claim. Peter got the boy and the woman inside the station house, where Ruth Kessler, the station master's wife, took over with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had delivered half the babies and doctored half the injuries within 20 miles, wrapping them both in quilts by the stove and pouring coffee, laced with something stronger than coffee, before Peter had even finished tying off his horse. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to, watching Hester Shepherd's shoulders finally stop shaking as the heat of the stove reached her, and only then did he go see to his horse and to the grim business of riding back out to look at what remained of the wagon. He did not find much worth salvaging. The seed corn was gone, dissolved into the current or scattered along the banks for a mile downstream, and the wagon bed itself was stove in on one side beyond any repair a homestead blacksmith could manage before spring planting had to start. It was, Peter understood as he stood on the bank in the wind with his wet clothes stiffening against him, a disaster for the Shepherd claim, coming as it did at the one time of year when a farm family could least afford to lose a week, let alone a season's seed. He thought about that all the way back to the station, and by the time he handed his horse off to the stable boy, he had already decided, in the quiet, deliberate way he decided most things, that he was going to help fix it. He found her in the station's back room an hour later, dressed now in a borrowed gingham dress of Ruth Kessler's that fit her poorly, sitting close by the stove with Danny asleep in a chair beside her, his head lolling against the wall. She looked up when Peter came in, and something in her face had settled since the creak. The fear burned away and replaced by a weary, watchful calculation that he recognized, because he did the same math himself most days. What has this cost me, and what can I still save? How bad, she said. Not a question really. A demand for the truth plainly made. The seed corn is gone, all of it near as I can tell. The wagon bed is broken past mending before planting time. Your team is unhurt, which is the one mercy in the whole business. He set his hat on the table and sat down across from her, because it did not seem right to loom over her while he said the rest of it. I am sorry, Mrs. Shepherd. Miss, she corrected quietly. I have no husband, Mr. Reed. There is only Danny and myself on the claim since my father passed this winter. That stopped him for a moment, though he kept his face still out of long habit. I am sorry for that, too. I had not heard. Most people around here do not care to say much about how he died, she said, and there was an edge under the words now, carefully controlled like a blade wrapped in cloth. He worked through the winter in Elias Cobb's coal mine up in the Wildcat Bluffs to pay down a debt on our claim, and a tunnel he had told Cobb's foreman was unsafe came down on him in February. Cobb sent $2 for the burying and called it a settlement in full. She looked at Peter directly, gauging him. You work for the stage line, I expect you know Cobb. Everyone who matters out here seems to owe him something. I know him, Peter said carefully. I have hauled freight past his diggings often enough. I did not know about your father. I am sorry for it, truly, and I am sorry it happened the way you say it happened, because I have heard other men say much the same about those tunnels and been told to mind my own business for saying so out loud. He hesitated, then added, because it seemed important that she know it plainly. I do not work for Cobb. I scout and guide for the stage and freight company, nothing more. I do not owe him a thing, and I would not care to, from what I hear. Something in her shoulders eased very slightly at that, though she did not smile. Then we understand each other a little at least. About the seed corn, Peter said. I have a little put by from scouting wages, more than I have use for out here where there is not much to spend it on. I would like to see you get corn in the ground this spring, Miss Shepherd, and I do not intend that as charity, only as a neighbor helping where a bridge I should have closed sooner did harm. She studied him a long moment, and he understood she was deciding something about him, weighing pride against necessity the way he imagined she weighed most things, and he waited without pushing, because pushing a woman like this, he already sensed, was the surest way to lose whatever ground a man had gained. I do not take charity easily, she said finally, but I will take a loan on paper with interest fair to both of us, and I will pay it back before the year is out, in corn or in coin. She lifted her chin. That is the only way I will take your money, Mr. Reed. Then that is how you shall have it, he said, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, smiling without meaning to. The weeks that followed did more to bind Peter Reed to the Shepherd claim than either of them expected, though neither called it courting, not at first. He rode out most days that his scouting duties for the stage line allowed, ostensibly to check on the loan he had made, though he generally found some excuse to stay long past any business the loan required. Hester's homestead sat on a good bend of Willow Creek, where a spring came up cold and sweet out of a limestone shelf, land her father had chosen with a farmer's eye for water and a fugitive's eye for defensibility, having learned in County Clare, before ever crossing an ocean, what it cost a family to hold ground that other men wanted. She told him about that, in pieces, over the weeks of mud season, while they worked. She told him while they were grafting cyan wood onto the wild plum thicket behind the sod house, her hands quick and sure with the knife, that her father had watched an English landlord's agents pull the thatch roof off his own father's cottage in Clare when she was a small child, for rent unpaid after 2 bad harvests, and that the memory of standing in the rain while men who owed them nothing decided their fate had followed Michael Shepherd across an ocean and half a continent, and had settled at last into a fierce, unbending refusal to ever again let any landlord, banker, or mine owner take what was his by paper tricks and hard leverage. He used to say a debt on paper is a rope, and the man who holds the paper is the one deciding how tight to pull it, she told Peter, working a graft into a cleft in the plum stalk with careful fingers while he held the branch steady for her. He came to Nebraska because the Homestead Act said the land would be ours outright after 5 years, with our names on the paper and no landlord's name above it. He would rather die owning 160 acres of Nebraska mud than live comfortable as any man's tenant. He got his wish in the end, Peter said quietly, and regretted it as soon as he had, but Hester only nodded, her jaw tight but her hands steady on the knife. He got the mud, and he got the debt too in the end because Cobb's terms for the winter loan were not honest terms, whatever they looked like on paper. She tied off the graft with a strip of cloth and straw and did not look up. I mean to see that debt paid clean and this land held free, Mr. Reed, whatever it costs me to do it. He believed her. He also, watching her work the plum branches with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, found himself wanting very much to be standing beside her when she did it. For his part, he told her about the ford, though it took him longer, and he told her at night, sitting on the step of the sod house while Danny slept inside and the stars came out hard and bright over the thawing prairie. He told her about guiding a family of homesteaders across a crossing on the Niobrara the previous spring, a crossing he had used a dozen times before without trouble, and how he had misjudged how fast a spring flood could rise between his scouting it in the morning and the wagons crossing it in the afternoon, and how a young woman named Ellen Marsh, riding in the second wagon, had been thrown into the current when the lead horse balked, and how he had gone in after her and not been fast enough, and had pulled her out already past saving. I have thought near every day since that if I had only ridden that crossing one more time before I called it safe, she would be alive yet, he said, looking out at the dark line of the creek rather than at Hester beside him. When your wagon went into Willow Creek, I thought for one black moment that I was about to watch it happen all over again, in the same season, at the same kind of crossing, and I could not have borne it a second time. But you were fast enough this time, Hester said, and her hand found his in the dark briefly, warm despite the cold night air. You were exactly fast enough, Mr. Reed. Peter, he said. I would take it kindly if you would call me Peter. Peter, then, she said, and he heard the small smile in her voice even though he could not see her face clearly in the dark. And you may call me Hester, since we seem to have gotten past the formal business of nearly drowning together. It was, he thought later, as close to a beginning as two careful, guarded people were likely to allow themselves that early, and it was enough. Over the weeks of April, as the roads dried and the freight wagons began rolling north again toward the Black Hills gold camps, Peter found reasons to be at the Shepherd claim 2 or 3 days out of every week, helping with the plowing when his scouting duties allowed, sitting up with Hester and Danny when a heifer calved badly in the night and needed 3 sets of hands to turn the calf right, teaching Danny to read sign along the creek bottom, the tracks of deer and the scrapes of a bobcat's claws, while Hester taught him, without ever quite meaning to become his teacher, the patient, practical knowledge of a farmer who had wrung a living out of unforgiving ground, which low places would flood and which would not, how to judge when the frost was truly out of the ground, how far apart to space corn so the roots would not compete for the little water the sandy soil could hold. He came to understand that her competence was not the kind that announced itself loudly. It simply was, the way the creek simply ran downhill, and he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, more at ease in her company than he had been with any person since the war had first put a rifle in his hands as a boy of 17 and sent him west. It could not, of course, remain so peaceful. Elias Cobb had not built his coal operation and his mercantile and his private lending business into the dominant power of the Willow Creek country by leaving loose threads untied. And the Shepherd claim, with its good spring water rising cold and constant even in dry years, sat directly astride the route he intended for a spur road to haul coal down to the freight trail without paying toll to cross another man's land. And moreover sat on the one water source in 5 miles reliable enough to supply a mine that was, by every account Peter had heard from teamsters passing through, working through its timber and its miners at a rate that would eventually require more water than the mine's own Dry Gulch could provide. Cobb came to call on the Shepherd place himself in the last week of April, riding a fine bay gelding with a Mexican saddle and 2 hired men trailing behind him at a distance that was meant to look casual and did not. Peter was there, up on the sod roof resetting a length of stovepipe, when Cobb rode into the yard, and he stayed where he was, close enough to hear, because something about the careful arrangement of those 2 hired men told him this was not a social call. Cobb was a broad, sandy-haired man of perhaps 50, well-fed in a country where most men were lean, dressed in a good black coat that had never seen a day's plowing, with small pale eyes that moved over the Shepherd claim the way a buyer's eyes move over livestock at auction, pricing rather than admiring. He touched his hat to Hester with a courtesy so exact it amounted to insult. "Miss Shepherd, I trust you are keeping well, in your circumstances." "Well enough, Mr. Cobb," Hester said, standing in her own dooryard with her arms crossed, giving him not 1 inch of ground though he sat above her on horseback. "What business brings you out from the mine?" "Your father's note is coming due at the end of May," Cobb said, in the mild, reasonable tone of a man discussing weather. $240, principal and interest, secured against this claim. I understand his passing has left the debt without the labor that was meant to retire a fair portion of it. I am prepared to be generous, Miss Shepherd. I will buy the claim outright at a fair price, settle the note from the proceeds, and let you and your brother keep what remains free and clear to start again somewhere less troublesome to hold." "This land is not for sale," Hester said, "and my father's note will be paid in coin before it comes due, not in acreage." $240 is a great deal of coin for a young woman with 1 season's corn to her name, Cobb said, and something moved behind the small pale eyes, patient and unhurried, a man accustomed to letting time do the pressing for him. "I would not want to see the note default and the claim sold at auction for whatever it brings a stranger, when I am standing right here offering a decent price to a neighbor. Think on it, Miss Shepherd. The offer will not stay open past the note's due date." He touched his hat again and turned the bay gelding, and his 2 hired men fell in behind him without a word having passed between them, and Peter, watching from the roof, thought that he had rarely seen a threat delivered with less noise and more menace than Elias Cobb had just managed in a dooryard in broad daylight. "He means to have this land," Hester said quietly, once the riders were well down the road. "One way or another." "Then we had better make certain the note is paid before the end of May," Peter said, climbing down from the roof, "and make certain, besides, that whatever figures he has written down against your father's name are honest figures, because I have heard enough from teamsters about how that company store reckons a man's wages to doubt they would hold up honest in a courtroom." That doubt, small and half-formed as it was that afternoon in April, would prove to be the seed of everything that followed. The fire came 11 days later, on a night when a warm wind out of the south had dried the mud roads enough that freight wagons were rolling steady again toward the Black Hills, and Hester Shepherd had ridden alone to Cobb's company store at the mine settlement to ask, plainly and without apology, to see the ledger page recording her father's labor credit against the note, because she intended to pay the balance in coin she had raised selling 2 heifers and every dollar of the loan Peter had advanced her. And she meant to know the true figure before she paid it. She got no satisfaction from the clerk on duty, a nervous young man named Tobias Wren who kept glancing toward the back office as though he expected to be overheard, and she left the store angry and empty-handed a little before full dark, riding for home along the wagon road with a temper too hot to notice much of anything behind her. What happened after she left, Peter would piece together only slowly, over the following days, from scraps and silences and one frightened young clerk's half-confessions. The company store burned to the ground before midnight, taking with it, by Cobb's own loud and public account the next morning, the entire ledger of accounts, $200 in cash from the safe, and very nearly the life of the night watchman, who had been struck on the head and left unconscious near the burning building. A woman's knitted shawl, scorched at one edge but plainly identifiable, was found near the watchman, and 3 separate men were prepared to swear they had seen Hester Shepherd riding away from the mine settlement at a hard gallop shortly before the flames were first noticed. By noon the next day, Sheriff Amos Dill, who held his office at Cobb's pleasure as surely as any hired hand held his job, had ridden to Willow Creek Station with a warrant for Hester Shepherd's arrest on charges of arson, theft, and assault, and Elias Cobb himself had ridden along behind him to post, in plain sight of the stage office and the freight teamsters watering their mules at the trough, a reward notice offering $200 for information leading to her capture. Peter arrived at the station from a scouting run north along the freight road just as the notice was being nailed to the wall, and he read it twice before he trusted himself to speak, because the woman described in that notice, dangerous and fled, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the woman he had watched graft plum branches with careful, patient hands, and sit up half the night to save a calf that was not even hers to lose sleep over. "That is a lie," he said, and his voice carried further across the yard than he intended, silencing the teamsters and drawing Sheriff Dill's attention along with Cobb's. "That is a sworn complaint and a judge's warrant, Mr. Reed," Cobb said, mild as ever, though his small eyes had gone flat and watchful. "I understand you have taken an interest in the young woman's affairs. I would advise you not to let that interest carry you into obstructing the law." "I have taken an interest in the truth," Peter said, "which is more than I can say for that notice. Hester Shepherd rode into your store yesterday evening to ask an honest question about her father's account, and rode home angry that she got no honest answer. I know the woman. She does not burn buildings and beat night watchmen over a ledger page." "You know her a few short weeks," Cobb said. "I have known men to be poor judges of character in a great many things where their affections have gotten ahead of their sense, Mr. Reed. That is neither here nor there. There is a $200 reward posted for her capture, and you are, by every account I have heard, the best tracker in 3 counties. I would think a scout's wages would not stretch so far that $200 means nothing to you." The offer hung in the air of the station yard, plain and ugly, and every teamster and stable hand within hearing turned to see what Peter Reed would say to it. And Peter understood, in the space of a single held breath, that whatever he answered now would be remembered, and repeated up and down the length of the Sydney Deadwood Road for a long while to come. "I will not take 1 cent of that money," he said, loud enough to be heard clear across the yard, "and I will not lift 1 finger to hunt down a woman I believe to be innocent of every charge on that paper. If you want her found, Sheriff, you may find her yourself, or hire some man with less regard for the truth than I have got. I intend to spend whatever it costs me to prove she never did what that notice claims, and I would be obliged if you would take your reward and your warrant and get off this station's ground." It was, he reflected afterward, not the most diplomatic speech he had ever given, and it cost him something with Sheriff Dill that he would go on paying for in small ways over the following weeks, but he did not regret a word of it, and the look Elias Cobb gave him as he wheeled his horse away, a look of cold and careful recalculation, told Peter he had just made an enemy far more dangerous than he had been before, and had also, without quite meaning the words to travel so far so fast, staked his own name publicly on Hester Shepherd's innocence. He found her that same evening, not because he tracked her, though he could have, but because she came to him, slipping down out of the bluffs above Willow Creek in the last gray light with Danny's old coat over her dress and a borrowed horse gone lame in one leg. Having spent the day hiding in a lined shack she and her father had built years before as a shelter for calving season. A shack Peter himself had never known existed until she led him to it that night. "They will hang the wrong person for this if I let them catch me before the truth comes out," she said, sitting close by a small, carefully shielded fire that threw almost no light beyond the shack's dugout walls, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee she was not drinking. "I did not set that fire, Peter. I swear it on my father's grave. I rode into that yard. I asked Tobias Wren a question he was too frightened to answer, and I rode home angry, and that is the whole of what I did." "I believe you," Peter said, and he meant it with a certainty that surprised him with its own depth. "I believed it before I saw your face just now, and I believe it more seeing it. But believing is not proving. Hester and Cobb has a sheriff, a warrant, and $200 of motive walking around loose in this county looking for you. We have got to find something harder than belief to set against all that." "Tobias Wren knows something," she said slowly. "He would not look at me straight when I asked about the ledger. A man does not get that frightened over an honest bookkeeping error." "Then we start with Tobias Wren," Peter said. "And we start careful, because if Cobb finds out we are asking, that boy's life will not be worth much either." They began the following night, in the hour after the mine settlement's lamps had gone dark, meeting Tobias Wren by prearrangement at a dry wash a half-mile from the settlement, a meeting Peter had arranged through a freight teamster he trusted, a man named Otis Grigg who hauled supplies for the mine and had no love for Cobb's company store prices. Tobias came on foot, glancing back over his shoulder every dozen steps, a slight young man of perhaps 20 who looked, in the moonlight, as though he had not slept properly in a week. "I did not set that fire," he said, before either of them had spoken a word, his voice cracking on the sentence. "I swear before God I did not, and I do not believe Miss Shepherd did either, but I am afraid to say who did, because Mr. Cobb's man Bragg was seen by 2 other clerks carrying a lantern behind the store not an hour before the fire started, and both of those clerks have already been told by Mr. Cobb himself that their family's credit at the store will be called due in full if they say one word of it to the sheriff." "Bragg," Peter said. "Cobb's mine boss. He does whatever Mr. Cobb tells him to do, and has for years," Tobias said. "I think the fire was set to burn the true ledger, the one that showed how much labor credit the miners had actually earned against their debts, because Mr. Cobb keeps a second set of books, a false set, that shows the men owing far more than they have truly borrowed, so that they can never work free of the company store no matter how hard or how long they labor. Miss Shepherd's father worked 11 weeks in that mine before he died, and by the true ledger, the one Mr. Cobb burned, he had very nearly paid off the whole note. By the false figures Mr. Cobb keeps now, since the true book is gone, Michael Shepherd still owes near $200, which is convenient, is it not, since that is very near the sum of the reward now posted for his daughter's capture." The pieces fell together in Peter's mind with the cold, sudden clarity of a trail sign finally read correctly after miles of confusion, and he saw, all at once, the whole shape of what Elias Cobb had built and was now defending. A debt that could never be paid because the true accounting of it had been deliberately destroyed, a homestead he wanted for its water, and a young woman conveniently blamed for burning the one piece of paper that would have proven the debt against her family already satisfied. "Is there any copy of the true ledger left anywhere?" Peter asked. "Any record at all besides what burned?" Tobias hesitated so long that Peter thought he would not answer, and then he said, very quietly, "Michael Shepherd did not trust Mr. Cobb's bookkeeping, not from the start. He asked me, months back, to make him a private copy of his own account, in my own hand on plain paper, whenever I totaled the mine's figures each month. I did it because I liked the old man, and because I did not trust the company's books myself. I do not know if he kept those pages or where, but if he did, they would show the truth of it in my own handwriting, which I would swear to before any judge in the territory." Hester made a small sound, half breath and half word, and pressed her hand to her mouth. "My father kept a tin box," she said, when she trusted her voice again, "under the floor of the calving shack. I always thought it held nothing but old letters from Claire and a few coins he was saving toward my mother's headstone. I never opened it, out of respect for what I thought was in it." They rode for the calving shack that same night, the three of them, Tobias too frightened by now to go home and face Cobb's mine settlement without knowing whether his own neck might soon be in danger for having said as much as he already had. And it was there, by lantern light, kneeling on the packed dirt floor with the boards pried up, that Hester found her father's tin box at last. And inside it, wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp, a slim stack of papers in a careful, unpracticed hand that was plainly Tobias Wren's, showing month after month of labor credited against the Shepherd note, the sum at the bottom, in the final entry dated only 3 days before Michael Shepherd's death, standing at $4.20 still owed against the whole $240 debt. $4, Hester whispered, staring at the figure as though she could not quite make her eyes accept it. "My father owed $4 when he died, not $240. Cobb's demand that I sell this land, or pay a note nearly paid in full, is built on nothing but a lie he set fire to hide." "It is more than that now," Peter said grimly, folding the papers back into their oiled cloth with careful hands, as though they were something alive and fragile. "It is proof that Cobb had every reason in the world to want that ledger gone, and no reason at all to want you found innocent, which means the arson charge against you is not only false, it is exactly backward. The man with the true motive to burn that store is the same man who posted the reward for your capture." It should have been enough that night to feel that the worst of the danger had passed, that truth had finally outweighed lies on the scale. But Peter had learned long ago, scouting trails through country where a man's confidence could get him killed as easily as his carelessness, that finding the right sign was never the same as reaching safety, and he was right to feel that caution even as relief tried to loosen his shoulders. Because Elias Cobb did not intend to let a tin box full of paper undo years of careful fraud without a fight. The fight came 4 days later, and it came harder and faster than any of them had prepared for. Sheriff Amos Dill, acting, as Peter would later learn, on a tip from one of Cobb's hired men who had noticed Otis Griggs' wagon standing too long near a dry wash on 2 separate nights, rode out to the calving shack at dawn with 3 deputized men, and though Hester and Peter had moved their meeting place twice already out of caution, they had not moved quite fast enough. Peter heard the horses first, the particular rhythm of several riders coming at a controlled trot rather than a gallop, men trying not to announce themselves and failing at it, and he had time only to press the oiled cloth bundle into Danny's hands and send the boy running for the willow brush along the creek before the shack was surrounded. "Hester Shepherd, you are under arrest by warrant of this county," Sheriff Dill called out, his voice carrying the particular false confidence of a man who did not entirely believe in the rightness of his own errand, but intended to see it through regardless. "Come out with your hands where I can see them, and nobody need get hurt over it." "She has done nothing, Amos," Peter called back, stepping out of the shack ahead of Hester with his own hands spread wide and empty, because he judged, correctly as it turned out, that Dill would hesitate longer over shooting a known local scout than he would over an accused woman. "I have got proof, real proof in a clerk's own hand, that the whole charge against her was built to cover Cobb's own fraud. Take her in if you must follow your warrant, but you had better also ride for a circuit judge, because there is a great deal more to answer for here than one burned store." Dill's eyes flicked toward the papers Peter held up, and for a moment something that might have been doubt crossed his weathered face, but one of the other riders, A broad man Peter recognized as one of Bragg's mine hands rather than a proper deputy at all, put his hand on his revolver and said, low and ugly, "That is not your affair, Reed. Step aside or you will be arrested alongside her for harboring a fugitive." What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always did, without the drama of a stage melodrama and with all the more menace for its plainness. The hired man's horse shifted sideways at a shout from Danny down by the creek, spooked by the boy's voice or by a covey of prairie chickens breaking cover. And in the half-second of confusion, Hester moved, not to flee, which Peter would learn later she had decided against on principle, believing flight would only make her look guiltier before a judge, but to put herself directly between the nervous hired man's horse and Peter, one hand raised, palm out. Her voice cutting through the noise, with a command that startled every man there into. "Stillness. Enough," she said. "I will go with the sheriff because I have done nothing I am ashamed to answer for before any honest court in this territory. But I will not have any man's blood spilled over it, mine own included, and I will not have Mr. Reed harmed for the crime of believing the truth. Sheriff Dill, I will ride with you peaceably to Sydney, and I expect that ledger evidence to be presented before whatever judge hears this case, or I promise you, when this is finished, every man in this county will know exactly whose orders you were following instead of your warrant." It was, Peter thought, watching her stand there in the pale morning light with her chin up and her voice steady, one of the bravest things he had ever seen a person do, more frightening to him in its way than the fire had been to any man on Cobb's property, because she was staking her own body and freedom on a belief that the law, even a law bent crooked by a rich man's money, would eventually bend back straight if enough true facts were laid before it plainly enough. Dill, to his limited credit, took her at her word and did not clap irons on her, only escorted her, riding her own horse, towards Sydney and the county jail there, while his hired deputies rode close on either side. Peter watched them go, every instinct in him screaming to intervene further, and made himself stand still, because he understood, in the cold, clear way he understood most dangers, that the fight was not going to be won on that creek bank with fists or threats. It was going to be won, if it was won at all, in front of a judge with paper and testimony and time, none of which he had in abundance, because word had already reached him, through Otis Griggs' nervous relay 2 days before, that Cobb had filed papers accelerating the foreclosure on the Shepherd note, claiming Hester's flight from arrest as proof of abandonment of the claim, and had scheduled the property for public auction at Willow Creek Station in 11 days' time. 11 days to save both the woman and the land, and only a tin box of borrowed handwriting and a frightened clerk's willingness to speak to stand against Elias Cobb's money and Sheriff Dill's badge. Peter Reed had spent his adult life reading trails that other men could not see, the faint disturbance of grass where a deer had passed a day before, the particular way water moved around a submerged rock that told him the depth of a ford before he ever touched it, and he applied every ounce of that same patient, watchful skill now to the problem in front of him, because he understood that panic would serve Hester Shepherd far worse than careful thought. He rode to Sydney first to see her, and found her in a small back room of the jail rather than a cell proper, Sheriff Dill having apparently decided that a woman with half the county's teamsters and freight men already muttering on her behalf was not a prisoner worth handling roughly. She looked tired when he came in but not broken, and the sight of her sitting straight-backed on a hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, steadied something in his own chest that had been shaking since the moment Dill's riders surrounded the calving shack. "You came," she said, and there was something naked in the way she said it, some admission she had not quite meant to make. "I told you I would spend whatever it cost me proving you innocent," Peter said, pulling the room's other chair close and sitting where he could speak low. "I did not say that just to make a fine speech in a stage yard, Hester." "I know it," she said, and reached out, taking his hand between both of hers, the first time she had touched him so plainly since the night in the calving shack. "I have had a great deal of time to sit here and think, and I have thought mostly of you, which I suppose tells me something I ought to have admitted to myself a good while back." "What is that?" he asked, though he thought he already knew, hoped he knew, and was afraid of hoping too much given everything still hanging over them. "That I did not only come to trust you because you pulled me out of a flood," she said, "though God knows that was a fine beginning. I trust you because you have shown me, over and over in small things, what kind of man you are when nobody with power is watching to reward you for it. My father used to say you could judge a man truly only by what he does when there is nothing in it for him. You have proven yourself that way a dozen times over since April, Peter Reed, and I find I have come to care for you a great deal more than is sensible for a woman presently charged with arson." He laughed, a short, startled sound, and lifted her hand to press his mouth against her knuckles, careful and unhurried despite the jail bars, and the guard just outside the door, and the 11 days ticking down against them. "I have cared for you since I pulled you out of that creek, and you swung at my jaw for it," he said. "I only did not think it fair to say so while you had a warrant hanging over your head and no way to answer it plainly." "Then let us answer it plainly," she said, "and once it is answered, you may say whatever else you please to me, and I promise I will not swing at your jaw for it." It was not, either of them would later say, a proper declaration of love, not with a jail guard's boots audible in the hallway and 11 days standing between them and any peace. But it was enough, in that gray little room, to carry Peter out the door and back onto his horse with a fire under him that no amount of Cobb's money or Dill's badge was going to put out. The 11 days that followed were the fastest and hardest of Peter's life. He rode first to the mine settlement itself, at night, and found Tobias Wren willing, though badly frightened, to write out a sworn statement before Sidney's notary describing both the second false ledger and Bragg's lantern seen behind the company store the night of the fire. A statement 2 other clerks, once they learned Tobias had already spoken and survived it, were finally willing to add their own names to. He rode to Fort Sidney and spoke with a young lieutenant he had scouted for during a brief Army contract 2 winters before. And though the Army had no direct authority over a civilian land dispute, the lieutenant knew a federal land office examiner stationed in Sidney, who did have authority to question the legitimacy of a foreclosure sale, and who agreed, once shown Tobias Wren's ledger copies and sworn statement, that the auction should proceed under close observation rather than be halted outright, since halting it without full legal cause might only delay Cobb's scheme rather than defeat it for good. He spent in those 11 days every dollar of his own savings on notary fees, on a telegraph message to the Territorial Land Office in Omaha requesting an official examiner be present, on a lawyer in Sidney willing to take Hester's defense for a fraction of his usual fee once he saw the strength of the evidence, and on paying Otis Grigg and 2 other teamsters a small wage to keep quiet watch on the mine settlement and the jail both, so that Cobb could not repeat whatever trick he had used to silence a ledger the first time. He spent, in total, considerably more than the $200 he had refused to take for Hester's capture, and he thought, riding the last stretch back toward Sidney on the evening before the auction with his saddlebags nearly empty of coin, and his horse worn thin from the pace he had kept, that he had never in his life spent money on anything that felt so entirely worth the cost. The morning of the auction dawned clear and mild, the kind of bright, wash-clean early May morning that follows a long, wet spring, the prairie around Willow Creek Station green with new grass for the first time since the thaw had begun, meadowlarks calling from fence posts where a season before there had been only mud and standing water. It should have felt, Peter thought, standing in the station yard with the crowd gathering, like a hopeful day, and in some ways it did, though the tension coiled tight in his chest allowed for little easy hope until the business of the day was settled one way or the other. Elias Cobb had made certain the auction drew a crowd, posting notice widely in hopes, Peter suspected, that a public sale witnessed by half the county would make any later challenge to its legitimacy harder to sustain. Freight teamsters, homestead families, the Kesslers from the stage station, Sheriff Dill standing near the makeshift auction block with an expression that suggested he had begun, at last, to have serious doubts about whose side he had been serving, and Cobb himself, mounted on his fine bay gelding, watching the gathering crowd with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome already settled. Hester stood near Peter, released that morning on her lawyer's bond pending the resolution of the arson charge, dressed in her own clothes again, dried and mended, her chin high despite the whispers that followed her through the crowd, some sympathetic, some still uncertain. Danny stood on her other side, and Tobias Wren, pale but resolute, stood a few paces off beside the federal land examiner Peter had brought from Sydney, a spare, precise man named Mr. Aldous Finch, who carried a leather satchel of documents and an expression of professional patience that suggested he had seen a good many contested land sales in his career, and intended to see this one conducted correctly regardless of how much money Elias Cobb had thrown at making certain it was not. The county auctioneer, a thin man named Purdy hired for the occasion, climbed onto the wagon bed that served as an auction block and began the proceedings with the flat, practiced patter of a man who did this often enough to feel nothing about it either way, describing the Shepherd claim, its acreage, its improvements, its spring, and calling for opening bids on the note's satisfaction. $240, Cobb said at once from horseback, not troubling to dismount, his voice pitched to carry across the whole yard. The full note, principal and interest, which I believe satisfies the debt and settles the claim to my ownership without further bidding necessary, gentlemen, since I doubt anyone here cares to outbid a settled note. Hold the sale, Peter said, stepping forward before the auctioneer could bring down whatever makeshift gavel he was using to declare the matter closed. There is evidence that note is not honestly stated, and this examiner from the Federal Land Office is here to see it heard before this sale goes one word further. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Cobb's calm satisfaction flickered just slightly into something harder. This is not a courtroom, Mr. Reed. This is a lawful auction of a defaulted note, and I will not have it disrupted by a man with no legal standing in the matter, whose interest in the young woman in question is, I think, plain to everyone gathered here. My interest in Hester Shepherd is plain, and I am not ashamed of it, Peter said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. But it is not the point standing before this crowd today, and you know it, Mr. Cobb. The point is whether that note was ever honestly $240 at all, and I have brought a man from the Federal Land Office to see the truth of it weighed before this sale, rather than after, when it would be too late to undo. Mr. Aldous Finch stepped forward then, opening his leather satchel with the deliberate, unhurried care of a man who understood the weight his office carried in a moment like this, and addressed the crowd in a dry, precise voice entirely unlike the auctioneer's practiced patter. I am here at the request of the Territorial Land Office, having been shown evidence sufficient to warrant examination before this sale proceeds. I have here a sworn statement, notarized in Sydney 4 days past, from a Mr. Tobias Wren, formerly employed as a clerk in Mr. Cobb's company store, describing a second, falsified ledger maintained separately from the true account of miners' labor credited against their debts. I have alongside it a set of monthly account pages, in Mr. Wren's own hand, kept privately at the request of the late Michael Shepherd, showing his true labor credit against the note in question. According to these pages, at the time of Michael Shepherd's death, the balance owed against this claim stood at $4.20, not $240. The murmur in the crowd rose to something closer to a rumble, and Cobb's face had gone pale beneath its sun-weathered color, though his voice, when he found it, remained steady with the particular brittle steadiness of a man watching his own careful construction begin to crack. "Forged documents," he said. "A disgruntled clerk and a discredited fugitive, conspiring to invent a debt that never existed." I would remind this crowd that Miss Shepherd stands accused of burning the very ledger these papers claim to copy, along with $200 in cash, and the near murder of an innocent night watchman. "There is more to say on that charge as well," Peter said, and this time it was Tobias Wren who stepped forward, his voice shaking at first but growing steadier as he spoke, the way a man's voice does when he has finally decided the fear of speaking is smaller than the fear of staying silent. "I did not set that fire, and I do not believe Miss Shepherd did either," Tobias said. "I saw Mr. Cobb's mine boss, Silas Bragg, carrying a lantern behind the company store less than an hour before the fire started, and I was not alone in seeing it. 2 other clerks saw the same, and were told by Mr. Cobb himself that their family's store credit would be called due in full if they spoke of it. I have sworn to what I saw before a notary in Sydney, and I am prepared to swear to it again before any judge who asks." Silas Bragg, standing near Cobb's stirrup among the small crowd of mine hands who had come along to watch their employer's triumph, went very still, and several of the men nearest him edged away, the particular instinctive distancing of men who did not care to be standing close to a person about to be publicly named for arson. "This is slander," Cobb said, his voice rising now, the mildness gone entirely, "brought by a woman already charged with the very crime being discussed, aided by a scout who has made his affections for her plain enough that his testimony is worth nothing, and a clerk who I dismissed from my employ not 4 days past for petty theft from the store's till." "You did not dismiss me," Tobias said, and though his voice still shook, it did not waver. "I left of my own will, once I understood what you had asked me to help hide. I have nothing left to lose by speaking now, Mr. Cobb, since you have already made certain I have no place left in your employ, and I would rather lose that than lose whatever is left of my own conscience." Mr. Finch, unmoved by the rising heat of the argument, held up a hand and addressed the auctioneer directly. "Given the evidence presented, and given that this office has authority to examine the legitimacy of any note underlying a forced sale of homestead land, I am obliged to suspend this auction pending a formal inquiry into the true balance of the Shepherd note. If the account pages presented today are found genuine, and I have no immediate reason to doubt Mr. Wren's sworn statement, the note stands satisfied at $4.20, a sum I understand Miss Shepherd is prepared to pay this very morning, and this sale is void." "I am prepared to pay it," Hester said, stepping forward at last, her voice ringing clear across the yard, and she drew from the pocket of her dress 5 silver dollars, more than enough to cover the true balance, and held them out not to Cobb but to Mr. Finch himself. "I have carried this sum with me every day for a week, Mr. Finch, in the hope that this day would come to exactly this point. I would ask that it be recorded, and that my father's note be marked paid in full, and this land recorded free and clear in my name, as the Homestead Act promised it would be, without any man's paper trick standing between me and what I have earned by 5 years of my own family's labor." Mr. Finch took the coins, counted out the correct sum with the same unhurried precision he had shown throughout, and returned the small remainder to her palm, and then, turning to the auctioneer, said simply, "This sale is void. I will require the county clerk's book brought to me this afternoon to record the note as satisfied, and to note, for the territorial record, that this office has cause to open a full inquiry into the accounting practices of the Cobb Coal and Freight Company, and into the circumstances of the fire at that company's store on the night in question." Sheriff Amos Dill, who had stood through the entire exchange with a face growing steadily more uncomfortable, finally stepped forward himself, and addressed Cobb directly, in front of the whole crowd, in a voice that carried the particular flatness of a man choosing, at last and perhaps too late, which side of a fight he wanted to be remembered as having stood on. "Elias, I am going to need you and Bragg both to come with me to Sydney, so this can be sorted proper before a judge. I have carried your warrant against Miss Shepherd longer than I ought to have without asking harder questions than I did, and I do not intend to compound that error by ignoring sworn testimony of arson and fraud standing right here in front of half this county." Cobb's face, for one long moment, showed something Peter had never seen on it before, a flicker of the same cold panic he had no doubt inflicted on a great many miners and homesteaders over his years of careful leverage. The panic of a man who has always controlled the terms of every exchange, suddenly finding himself with no terms left to control. He looked briefly, as though he might spur the bay gelding and run, but two of the freight teamsters, men who had hauled coal from his mine for wages he had underpaid for years, and had lost patience with him long before this morning, moved their own horses to block the yard's exit, not violently, only immovably, the way men do when they have quietly decided among themselves that a reckoning is finally due. "This is not finished," Cobb said to no one in particular, his voice gone thin, and Sheriff Dill said, not unkindly but without any give in it either, "No, it is not, Elias. That is exactly the point. It is going to Sydney to a judge where it should have gone from the start." They led him away at a walk, Bragg beside him looking considerably smaller than he had appeared astride a horse an hour before, and the crowd parted to let them through and then closed back in behind them, already breaking into a dozen separate conversations, the particular buzzing energy of a community that has just watched an old and unspoken fear finally called out into daylight and found, to its own surprise, that daylight was enough to shrink it. It took the better part of the afternoon for the crowd to fully disperse, for Mr. Finch to finish his notes and depart with promises to see the true inquiry properly opened, for the county clerk to be located, and the satisfaction of the note formally recorded in the book he carried out from Sydney, for Danny to finish shaking hands with what felt like every teamster on the Sydney-Deadwood Road, each of them wanting to tell him some version of how they had never trusted Cobb's reckoning and always known his sister for an honest woman. A claim more comfortable to make now than it had been a week before, though Peter noted with quiet amusement that Hester accepted every one of these late declarations of faith with far more grace than he would have managed in her place. By the time the last wagon had rolled out of the station yard, and the last curious neighbor had ridden off toward home, the sun had swung well past noon and hung low and gold over the western bluffs, throwing long shadows across the new green grass, and Willow Creek Station had settled back into its ordinary quiet, the creek running clear and full in the distance, the meadowlarks calling again now that the crowd's noise had finally faded. Peter found Hester standing alone by the corral fence, watching the empty road where the last of the wagons had disappeared, her arms crossed against the cooling evening air, and something in the set of her shoulders, some tension finally allowed to loosen now that there was no one left to watch her hold herself steady, told him the day's cost had been higher for her than she had let show while it mattered. "It is done," he said, coming to stand beside her at the fence rail. "The land is yours, clear and recorded, and Cobb is riding to Sydney to answer for a great deal more than one burned store. Tobias Wren's testimony alone should see the arson charge against you dismissed within the week, once a judge hears it plain." "I know it," she said, and her voice, for the first time since the fire, allowed itself to shake just slightly at the edges. "I have known it since Finch spoke, and still I find I have been standing here for the better part of an hour unable quite to believe it is true. My father held this land for 5 years against drought and grasshoppers, and one hard winter after another, and I have spent the last month believing I might lose it to a man's forged ledger, and a lie about a fire I never set. It is a great deal to set down all at once, Peter, this fear I have been carrying." "Then set it down," he said gently, and turned her by the shoulder so she faced him rather than the empty road. "And let me carry some of it instead. if you will let me. Not because you cannot carry your own weight. Hester Shepherd, God knows, you have proven these last weeks that you can carry more than most men I have known. But because I would like very much to spend the rest of my life making sure you never again have to carry that particular kind of weight alone. She looked up at him, the last gold light of the evening catching in her gray-green eyes, and whatever careful composure she had held through the long, frightening weeks since the bridge collapsed finally gave way entirely, not into tears, though there were tears standing in her eyes, but into something that was almost laughter, almost disbelief, entirely relief. "Are you asking me to marry you, Peter Reed?" Standing at a corral fence with the smell of horse manure in the air and half the county's gossip still ringing in my ears. "I am," he said, and found he was smiling despite the seriousness of the question, because there was something in her bluntness that had always undone whatever careful reserve he tried to keep around her. I considered waiting for a more romantic moment, but I have learned this spring that a man who waits too long for the perfect crossing sometimes finds the water has already risen too high to cross safely at all. I love you, Hester. I loved you, I think, from the moment you swung at my jaw in that creek, and I understood you were not a woman who would ever simply let herself be swept along by whatever the current decided for her. I would like to spend my life on this land with you, if you will have me, farming when the season calls for farming and scouting when the stage line needs a guide. And I would like, very much, to never again have to imagine a world where I did not pull you out of that water in time. You did pull me out in time, she said, and reached up to press her palm against his jaw, the same jaw she had struck weeks before, though now with a gentleness that made the memory almost funny between them. And I would like that life very much, Peter Reed. I would like it more than I have words ready to say. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed her then at last, there by the corral fence in the fading gold light, with the creek running full and clear behind them, and the empty road stretching quiet toward Sydney, where a corrupt man was riding to finally answer for years of quiet cruelty. And it was not a hurried kiss, or a desperate one, but the slow, sure kind that comes when two careful, guarded people have finally decided the risk of trusting each other is smaller than the cost of holding back any longer. Danny found them there a few minutes later and had the good grace, for a 15-year-old boy, to pretend he had not noticed anything unusual, though the wide grin he could not quite suppress told a different story, and Ruth Kessler, watching from the station house doorway with her arms folded and an expression of deep satisfaction, told her husband that night that she had known it would come to this since the very afternoon in April when Peter Reed had come dripping wet into her back room, and had not been able to stop his eyes from finding Hester Shepherd's face every few minutes, even while pretending his whole attention was on the coffee. The formal inquiry into Elias Cobb's affairs took the better part of that summer to conclude, though its outcome was never seriously in doubt. Once Mr. Aldous Finch's report reached the Territorial Land Office and Tobias Wren's sworn testimony, joined eventually by 3 other clerks who found their courage once the first fear of speaking had passed, laid out the full pattern of falsified ledgers, inflated debts, and coerced labor that had trapped a dozen families besides the Shepherds in a debt that could never be honestly repaid. Cobb was convicted that autumn on charges of fraud and arson, the fire itself proven at last to have been set on his direct order by Silas Bragg, who testified against his former employer in exchange for a lighter sentence of his own, and the Cobb Coal and Freight Company's assets were seized and sold at a lawful auction of an entirely different character than the one that had nearly taken the Shepherd homestead, with the proceeds used in part to settle the true, honest debts of the mine's other laborers, freeing them at last from a peonage they had believed, for years, they had no lawful way to escape. Hester Shepherd and Peter Reed were married in October, once the last of the harvest was in, and the arson charge against her had been formally and permanently dismissed by a circuit judge in Sydney, who took evident satisfaction in saying so aloud in open court, with most of Willow Creek Station standing witness in the yard behind the sod house Michael Shepherd had built with his own hands 9 years before, the same yard where Cobb had once sat on his fine bay, gelding delivering quiet threats. Now hung with early autumn asters and strung with lanterns against the coming dark. Peter never did claim the $200 reward Cobb had once offered for Hester's capture, and in fact never spoke of it again except once, years later, when a young stage passenger asked him idly whether the story he had heard about a scout who refused reward money to save an innocent woman was really true. "It is true enough," Peter said, with his wife's hand resting easy in his own and the Willow Creek homestead's fields spreading green and gold behind them in the mild spring light, corn coming up straight in rows Hester had planted herself. "Though I would tell you the money was never really the point of it. The point was that I had failed once badly at saving someone I ought to have saved, and when the chance came to do differently, I found I could not stand to fail at it twice, whatever it cost me to get it right. As it turned out, getting it right cost me every dollar I had and gave me back in the end a great deal more than any reward money could ever have bought." Hester only smiled at that and said nothing, because she had long since stopped needing to add anything to the story herself. The land under her feet, held free and clear in her own name exactly as the law had once promised her father it would be, and the man standing beside her, steady and watchful in hers, said everything that needed saying, and had gone on saying it quietly and completely every single day since.